Boa tarde, senhoras e senhores. Uma alegria e uma honra enorme conduzir esta segunda parte do dia de inauguração do Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. O Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos, como alguns de vocês já ouviram na cerimônia solene de lançamento do CENA, é um sonho há muito perseguido por vários de nós. A rigor, ele vem integrar o conjunto dos centros de estudos regionais da Diretoria de Relações Internacionais da UFMG. Anteriormente, nós contávamos na Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais com um centro de estudos de América Latina, um centro de estudos para a Europa, um centro de estudos para a África, outros centros de estudos para a Ásia Oriental e, finalmente, um centro de estudos para a Índia, para a região do Índico. Mas, a partir da presente data, eu fico muito feliz e orgulhoso de poder dizer isso, nós temos um 6º centro de estudos regionais dedicado primordialmente a Estados Unidos e Canadá. Eu faço uma nota rápida aqui, uma nota metodológica sobre o entendimento de América do Norte. Ele, evidentemente, existe uma dimensão histórica que justifica o fato de o nosso Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos dedicar-se majoritariamente a Estados Unidos e Canadá. O que eu quero dizer é que o Centro de Estudos Latino-Americanos já envolvia o México, não é? Então, do ponto de vista geográfico, o México foi, digamos, deslocado para a região da América Latina, e o México já desfruta de uma centralidade muito grande no Centro de Estudos Latino-Americanos. Existe, inclusive, um núcleo de estudos mexicanos, uma parceria da UFMG com a UNAM, que é a maior universidade do México, e o nosso entendimento ainda se pautou por critérios que são, digamos, sociológicos. Então, havia já o acumulado histórico, institucional, não é? Uma presença forte do México no Centro de Estudos Latino-Americanos, mas ainda o reconhecimento, que é amplo, de que o ambiente, o milieu acadêmico de Estados Unidos e de Canadá ele é diferente. Ele tem características próprias. Quer dizer, existe uma densidade distinta, existe um modo de se ver a produção do conhecimento, a aplicação do conhecimento, que é diferente, e nos parecia importante fazer esse tipo de, digamos, consideração, não é? Então, assim vem ao mundo um Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos que me parece muito bem azeitado a essa altura, não é? Muito amadurecido, e, por todos os critérios que a gente emprega, ele é um centro necessário para facilitar a cooperação da UFMG com os Estados Unidos, com o Canadá, para potenciar ainda mais essa cooperação e até, eu diria, para consagrar um processo de longa data de aproximação do nosso país com os Estados Unidos e com o Canadá, dois parceiros da maior importância, não só academicamente, mas diplomaticamente, economicamente. Então, é como se fosse uma espécie de consagração, o dia de hoje, né, de um processo que tem raízes muito profundas. Isso nos deixa muito, muito satisfeitos. Esta ocasião solene teve, no primeiro momento, né, a fundação do centro. A nossa reitora conduziu a sessão no prédio da reitoria, e agora a gente começa, efetivamente, com as atividades acadêmicas, que são a razão de ser dos centros de estudos regionais. Esta primeira sessão acadêmica oficial do CENA, ela contará com a participação ilustre de dois professores dos Estados Unidos da América, os professores Brian Purnell e Jason Casellas, que nos brindarão com os seus entendimentos, as suas visões sobre um tema altamente importante, não só para os Estados Unidos da América, mas eu diria para o Brasil contemporâneo. Tema das relações étnicas, não é? Política e diversidade étnica nos Estados Unidos. Conversaremos sobre isso. Me parece um tema absolutamente central para se entender os Estados Unidos da América, mas, curiosamente, para se entender Brasil também. Não é? Uma reflexão sobre o objeto, ela também é útil para que nos pensemos, para que reflitamos sobre nós mesmos. Então, esse é mais ou menos o plano para essa segunda parte da solenidade oficial de inauguração do CENA. Eu quero, antes de convidar os colegas professores estadunidenses, eu quero apenas fazer algumas notinhas institucionais muito rápidas. Eu gostaria, em primeiro lugar, de apresentar a vocês o professor Aristóteles Góes Neto, aqui à minha direita. Professor Aristóteles, em cuja pessoa eu abraço os membros do Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos, desse nascente CENA. Ele coordenará as atividades do centro. Ele é professor da UFMG, Instituto de Ciências Biológicas, tem uma longa trajetória também de cooperação em pesquisa com os Estados Unidos, também uma aproximação com o Canadá, e eu gostaria que vocês o conhecessem por ele mesmo, ou seja, quero convidá-lo a dar algumas palavrinhas, né, a se apresentar para a nossa comunidade acadêmica. Por favor, professor.
Obrigado, Davidson, pelas palavras. É um dia muito feliz, né? Já tem alguns meses que a gente está sonhando com esse dia, né, da inauguração do lançamento oficial do Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos. Então, rapidamente, eu vou me apresentar para vocês, né? A gente, não somente o CENA é composto por mim como coordenador, temos mais 4 colegas, né? Cada um de áreas distintas. 2 estão aqui presentes aqui, o Ulisses e a Mariana, né? O Ulisses é da Faculdade de Medicina, a Mariana é da Belas Artes, né? E a ideia é, como o Davidson falou, a gente implementar e fomentar, tentar catalisar o máximo possível essas interações entre a comunidade acadêmica, a UFMG, e as instituições, universidades, institutos de pesquisa, como também ONGs e empresas dos Estados Unidos e do Canadá, com a UFMG. Então, inicialmente, a gente vai fazer um diagnóstico, ver tudo como se encontra, sistematizar esses dados, ter uma base de dados atual, atualizável, que a gente pode passar para todos os parceiros, ver quais são as lacunas e tentar implementar isso da melhor maneira possível. Tá, falando um pouquinho brevemente de mim, eu sou biólogo, né? Eu sou doutor em botânica, na verdade, mas eu trabalho muito na área de bioinformática, metagenômica, essa parte de ômicas, de uma maneira geral. E eu tenho assim uma longa tradição realmente de parceiros, né, principalmente na Universidade de Maryland, lá nos Estados Unidos, ali próximo a Washington. Conheço bastante o pessoal lá da Academia Americana de Ciências. Então, assim, é um prazer muito grande eu estar agora como coordenador do centro. E, enfim, é isso. Eu gostaria de agradecer a todos aqui presentes e vamos iniciar, né, o nosso evento, o primeiro oficialmente, na parte do centro. E eu retorno a palavra para o Davis. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor Aristóteles. Então, seguindo com as notinhas institucionais, eu quero também fazer um agradecimento aqui ao Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política da UFMG, que nos apoia desde o primeiro momento, apoia a DRI e apoia também esta sessão. Essa sessão também ela é um seminário para os estudantes de Ciência Política, vários aqui presentes, nos prestigiando. Então, na pessoa da professora Natália Sátira, eu quero agradecer à comunidade de politólogos da UFMG. E ainda, e mais importante, eu quero publicamente aqui expressar minha gratidão à cônsul dos Estados Unidos em Belo Horizonte, a senhora Rita Rico. Acreditem em mim, senhoras e senhores, não teria sido possível sem o apoio, sem a dedicação incansável dos nossos colegas, colaboradores, apoiadores dos Estados Unidos da América, a realização desta meta, deste objetivo. Uma das políticas da atual gestão, do reitorado da UFMG, é efetivamente buscar uma universalização das relações da universidade com o mundo. E, inexplicavelmente até, a gente até consegue explicar, mas não faria muito sentido que uma universidade do porte da UFMG não pudesse contar com estruturas institucionais para cooperar perenemente com os Estados Unidos e Canadá, dada a importância que esses parques acadêmicos, tecnológicos, científicos têm para o mundo. Mas agora a gente já pode, enfim, contar com essa estrutura, ela está criada, ela existe, ela já está em funcionamento. Mas, se não fosse esse apoio, esse compromisso institucional do consulado, e a Rita encarna essas virtudes muito bem, não é? Ela é sempre, o suporte dela não falhou em nenhum momento. Foi uma trajetória razoavelmente longa, 1 ano e meio. Nunca é simples, na universidade pública brasileira, botar de pé uma institucionalidade completamente nova, não é? Nunca é simples, mas, pouco a pouco, e com o suporte do Departamento de Estado dos Estados Unidos, com o suporte do consulado em Belo Horizonte, do escritório em Belo Horizonte, da Embaixada dos Estados Unidos em Brasília, nós, enfim, chegamos ao ponto em que chegamos, e é só o começo de uma bela história, tenho certeza, de cooperação acadêmica. Então, por favor, aceite, em nome da UFMG, Rita Rico, a nossa gratidão, os nossos agradecimentos. Realmente, e na sua pessoa, eu também abraço e cumprimento todos os funcionários do escritório, nomeadamente minha ex-aluna, Cíntia, que tem sido incansável também na luta pela construção de instituições, Institution Builder. Ela certamente é uma belíssimo ativo da equipe. Então, fundamentalmente, as minhas palavras institucionais eram essas, agradecimentos gerais a todos, essa audiência qualificada que comparece aqui. Eu quero fazer algumas palavrinhas ainda de reconhecimento aos embaixadores, a Maria Auxiliadora Figueiredo, Benoni Belli. É uma honra e uma alegria enorme tê-los aqui conosco, ter o Itamaraty tão bem representado. Certamente essa ocasião ganha uma outra conotação com gente tão importante, de tão grosso calibre. Mas é isso, acho que já falei muito. Vou, então, convidar a minha colega de mesa, Rita Rico, a fazer uma apresentação dos colegas estadunidenses.
Isso. Boa tarde a todos e todas. É uma alegria para mim e para meus colegas da Embaixada e meu escritório da Embaixada aqui em Belo Horizonte estar com vocês na inauguração do Centro de Estudos Norte-Americanos, ou CENA. Na verdade, como mencionou a vice-reitora lá na inauguração, mais cedo, começou essa iniciativa faz anos. Na verdade, antes de meu tempo aqui em Belo Horizonte, mas em 2017 foi a primeira vez que então a vice-reitora mencionou para a gente na embaixada essa ideia. E daí a gente começou a falar e o embaixador chegou em 2018 com o diretor de Fulbright e teve várias ações para poder chegar hoje e podemos ver o resultado deste trabalho nesta mesa e agora com os 2 professores americanos que vou apresentar para vocês. Em meu escritório, fizemos questão de encontrar os especialistas americanos adequados e perfeitos para começar esse centro com o pé direito. Para realmente compreender a história dos Estados Unidos e as bases de nossa política, é crucial entender os efeitos da guerra civil e da escravidão em nossa economia e sociedade. E, por outro lado, após as últimas eleições presidenciais nos Estados Unidos, muitos se perguntaram o que levou o presidente Trump a ganhar a corrida eleitoral. E para entender este panorama, é preciso examinar nossa política atual. Depois da palestra de hoje, será mais fácil para vocês entenderem os Estados Unidos para além do que vocês provavelmente já conhecem e viram de nossa cultura popular, como o Super Bowl, os cantores como Queen Bee, Beyoncé, John Mayer, ou todos os shows de Netflix, e muitos outros que eu poderia listar sem parar, né? Mas os Estados Unidos e o Brasil são similares em muitos aspectos, e acredito que relações raciais seja um deles. A verdade é que mesmo que quando estamos tratando de assuntos diversos como urbanização, acesso à educação e saúde e mobilização política, nos deparamos com questões de disparidade racial em ambos os países. E estas relações influenciam nossa política e sociedade. Além disso, outro ponto que merece destaque é o papel dos imigrantes e, mais ainda, dos estadunidenses de origem latino-americana nos debates e dinâmicas eleitorais. Estes grupos, que incluem minha própria família, porque Rico é um sobrenome mexicano, vêm remodelando a identidade dos Estados Unidos. Entender o papel da política étnica e racial é fundamental para a compreensão da atual situação do meu país. Então, qualquer programa de estudos americanos deve incluir esses aspectos. Por isso, convidamos estes dois professores para falar sobre importantes marcos na história dos Estados Unidos, como as leis Jim Crow, a segregação racial e o papel deste novo grupo de estadunidenses de origem latino-americana nos Estados Unidos. Professor Brian Purnell ensina os estudos afro-americanos na Bowdoin College, no estado mais ao leste dos Estados Unidos, Maine. Professor Purnell é autor de 2 livros que discorrem sobre as leis Jim Crow e os efeitos da mesma no norte e no sul dos Estados Unidos. Ele possui uma vasta experiência e tem vários artigos publicados sobre questões raciais, suas origens na história americana e seus legados na sociedade atual. Ele é PhD em História pela New York University. Por sua vez, Jason Casellas, professor de Ciências Políticas na Universidade de Houston, em Texas, Texas. Igual. E autor de um livro que aborda a representação latina no Congresso e outras instituições do governo americano. E está trabalhando em um novo livro sobre republicanos latinos no atual governo. Seus estudos sobre a representatividade e impactos das minorias no sistema político americano é vasto e vários de seus artigos sobre o tema já foram publicados. Ele é PhD em política por Princeton University em New Jersey. Antes de passar a palavra a estes 2 professores e especialistas em suas áreas de estudo, gostaria de informar para os interessados em estudar nos Estados Unidos, talvez depois de formar aqui no UFMG, podem contar com o auxílio de nossos escritórios Education USA. São fontes oficiais de informações e serviços gratuitos para quem quiser estudar ou ingressar em uma universidade americana nos Estados Unidos. Basta acessar o site educationusa.state.gov e procurar os contatos de orientadores em Belo Horizonte, ou mesmo os outros que estão espalhados por Minas Gerais. Ou procurar meu escritório, Ana Lúcia, também depois da palestra. Sem mais demora, vou convidar a mesa a tomar nossos assentos lá e vamos convidar a professor Casellas e professor Brian Purnell aqui ao cenário e dar inauguração a esta palestra.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Thank you to the translators. They're working very hard, and I'm going to try to make their job easier by speaking a little slower. I'm sorry I don't speak Portuguese let's do this again, and hopefully I can change that in a couple years. Just a few words of introduction to the subject. 2019, this year, is the 400th anniversary of slavery, of racial slavery in the United States. 400 years ago, the first recorded shipment of people from Africa came to the colony of Virginia and started the process of racial slavery in the United States. Now, slavery in the United States, like slavery in Brazil, relied upon the importation of people from Africa to perform unpaid work and build wealth. An interesting difference between our countries is that Brazil imported the largest number of Africans in the Western Hemisphere. The estimates are at about between 5 and 6 million direct imports from the African continent between the 16th century, the 1500s, and 1880, I believe, 1888. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery. The United States imported directly from Africa the smallest number of direct shipments of people, only about 350,000. But between 1619 and 1860, the population of enslaved people in the United States grew to 4 million. And the way that that happened was because the United States developed, excuse me. Do I need this? Can I just? Okay, oh, right, okay. Ooh, sorry. The United States developed a system in which anybody born of an enslaved woman, no matter who the father was, became a slave. And this has very important effects on the role of blackness and on the role of being a descendant of a person of Africa in United States culture and history and society. Now, what I'm speaking about today happens long after slavery ends. I'm speaking about the 20th century. I'm speaking about a policy, I'm so sorry, a policy called affirmative action. The last definition that I want to give is to just explain that affirmative action in the United States develops as a policy to address or to try and fix the history of racial discrimination from slavery and after slavery. Affirmative action involved two main areas of American life. It involved an economic area, and it involved a civil or cultural area. It involved employment and jobs and the awarding of government contracts to do work with the government. And it involved admissions into colleges and universities. So I'm going to speak about the history of the policy of affirmative action And I want to raise the question, which we can hopefully talk about later. If whether or not paying attention to race in the present is a useful way to deal with the injustices that happened in the past and continue to have effects in the present. A little bit closer. All right. All right. Very good. I'm sorry. I don't normally use a microphone. I apologize. Let's see if this is, just make sure this is working. Okay. Affirmative action policies can draw fierce lines of political battle. Defenders, like the person in this image, charge their opponents with racist attacks against recruitment, hiring, retention, and promotion policies that help racial and ethnic minorities and women in college admissions and in the workplace. Opponents of affirmative action claim that policies that help racial minorities are themselves racist. Opponents fight against affirmative action practices because they argue that affirmative action, and I'm just going to go down these, promotes what Americans call reverse discrimination, or affirmative action for racial minorities promotes discrimination against white people. Affirmative action ignores the best qualified candidates in favor of unqualified or underqualified individuals. Opponents charge that affirmative action hurts more than it helps the people who benefit, and that affirmative action violates U.S. law because it establishes quotas based on race. Now, currently, right now, in the United States, a federal district court is reviewing a case on behalf of Asian Americans who say that Harvard University's affirmative action policy favors minority applicants, blacks and Hispanics, with lower admissions scores, lower test scores, and lower grades over Asian Americans with perfect academic records. Since 1995, the U.S. Supreme Court has declared that overt racial preferences in employment decisions or the awarding of government contracts can only occur if the selection criteria is narrowly tailored and if the racial preferences fulfill a compelling state interest. If universities and colleges or companies and employers, if they use race to make decisions, they have to be, in the eyes of our Supreme Court, they have to be narrowly tailored, which means you can't just look at someone and say, we're going to hire him because he's black or because he's Latino. You have to say he's qualified, he's smart, he's ready, and he is a racial minority, and we don't have many racial minorities in our corporation. That's what the court means by narrowly tailored. The court also says you can only do this if it fulfills a compelling state interest. And this will make sense when I speak mostly about higher education. So, race must be one of many different considerations in employment or in the awarding of government contracts. Otherwise, the practice is illegal. Since 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court has declared that universities and colleges must use the same rules in admission processes but it added that diversity is a compelling state interest. That to have a diverse, college-educated class of Americans is in the interest of the American state. That's what the Supreme Court said in 1978. This has allowed affirmative action to continue in most higher education admissions practices, although some states, like California and Michigan, have outlawed the use of all racial preferences through statewide votes. And Texas replaced its system of racial preference with a statewide plan to allow 10%, the top 10% of all high school graduates, or ingenio medio, all high school graduates, the top 10% can go to Texas universities. Now, the history of affirmative action in the United States reveals the complicated nature of how politics and ethnic diversity evolve in a multiracial democracy. This is where I think we can have a dialogue about how these policies evolved in the United States and how you might think of them in Brazil. Multiracial democracies with histories of colonialism, racism, discrimination, segregation, and social exclusion have a lot of work to do in their present, now, today, to address the truths of their past in honest, positive ways. The United States offers lessons about the positive benefits of racial affirmative action and the debates and controversies that can arise in a democracy around the use of racial preference to redress historic injustice. The U.S. example also raises some questions about whether affirmative action policies as they exist today do enough to redress social inequalities born of histories of racial discrimination. Now, affirmative action started during the 1930s and 1940s, the period of U.S. history known as the New Deal. This was during the Great Depression, a time period of massive unemployment, government austerity, the collapse of the global economy, widespread poverty, dislocation of families, and the New Deal was the set of policies that the United States government created to try and stop the economic calamity of the Great Depression. This is when affirmative action began, and it begins not with education, but with employment. It also extends into the years of World War II. At that time, affirmative action dealt with employment and jobs. In 1933, Congress passed a law which, for the first time, announced the principle of equal job opportunity in federal employment. Quote, "No discrimination shall be made on account of race, color, or creed." That was the rule that the federal government made in any New Deal program that gave jobs to unemployed Americans. No discrimination on the count of race, color, and creed would occur in those programs. Now, promoting non-discrimination did not stop state governments or companies that held government contracts from denying Black Americans jobs in programs. As the United States prepared for production and manufacturing to send guns and bombs and planes and ships to allies in Europe, and then to supply its own military in World War II, African Americans around the country, like this picture here of this man, waged protest to demand equal hiring in any company that had contracts with the U.S. government. the president passed an executive order. And an executive order in the United States is a presidential decree. It's not a law. Its influences are limited to the presidential powers in our Constitution. But the president in World War II said that as the commander of the army, and with the need to build bombs and planes and ships, that companies could not afford to discriminate against workers. So the president passed an executive order that extended non-discrimination in employment. This created the first federal oversight regulation committee called the Fair Employment Practices Commission. But enforcement was always weak, except in cases of overt racism, blatant racism and discrimination. How could the regulating agency tell? How could it prove that companies discriminated against black workers? Would companies that held government contracts, lucrative contracts during the wartime period, big business, would companies have to hire a certain amount of black people to prove that they did not discriminate? And if they had to do that, what percentage, what number would be the number to prove that you're not racist? And if you have a number, a set number, to prove that you're not, is that illegal? These are the questions that came out of the New Deal in World War II. This was also a time, according to the political historian Ira Katznelson, when the US government practiced massive preferential treatment in policies and programs that benefited white Americans. The title of the book that Ira Katznelson wrote was When Affirmative Action Was White. Most Americans only think of affirmative action benefiting blacks, Latinos, and women. Ira Katznelson showed that there was a time period during the New Deal and during World War II when there were affirmative action type programs that had massive benefits on white people that lasted for generations. If affirmative action includes government or state policies that use racial preferences to benefit one group of people, then Ira Katznelson, the author of this book, argued that during the 1930s and 40s, white Americans benefited from their race in ways that altered class relations for at least 3 generations, if not longer. Government loan programs and racially exclusive suburbs enabled millions of white Americans to become property owners. Black Americans were denied those government-subsidized loans, or they were forced to live in racially restricted, substandard housing markets, in which they paid more money at higher interest rates for worse housing. Federal Social Security programs and labor protections passed during the New Deal did not apply as a rule to the industries in which most black people worked, agricultural work and service work. The post-war Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or what in America they call the GI Bill, a law that gave benefits to men who served in World War II. The GI Bill enabled almost 8 million veterans to attain college educations, and this law, this benefit, did not apply to black men who were in the Army, mostly because they could not go to colleges where they lived because those colleges were racially segregated. These preferences for whites created a massive expansion of the American middle class. These preferences created generational wealth through home ownership, and they excluded a generation of African Americans. Not until the late 1960s did some black Americans begin to see similar benefits. after the war, after World War II, the United States witnessed significant movements towards racial integration. In 1947, the most popular sport, the most popular professional sport in the United States, allowed black men to play in baseball. Jackie Robinson becomes the first black player to play in Major League Baseball. Also, after the war, the Democratic Party made equal rights a part of its national political agenda. In 1954, a major U.S. Supreme Court case unanimously declared that racial segregation in education was illegal, was unconstitutional. You could not discriminate on the basis of race in American schools after 1954, according to our court. This ruling overturned 58 years of federal protection for states that openly discriminated against black citizens in public education. Racial integration was also bipartisan. It wasn't just the Democratic Party that did this. In 1957, the Republican president passed a new civil rights law that gave protections for black people to vote. Now, the post-war policies and the general feeling after the war, the general feeling after World War II against fascism and against racial nationalism, this increased citizens' expectations for their country to tear down racial segregation practices in all forms of U.S. life. A civil rights movement spread through the entire nation. And for the first part of the 1960s, nonviolent protest, like you see in this picture, would provoke confrontations with police in states that had racial segregation laws. The national leadership, beginning with President Kennedy, began to endorse affirmative action in employment in industries that had government contracts. Although President Kennedy, when he endorsed affirmative action in employment, never defined what that would mean. This is going to be a major problem in affirmative action in the United States, the lack of a clear definition about what the policies mean. The civil rights movement caused Congress and the president to pass progressive legislation that outlawed racial preferences in all areas of civil life. In 1964, the U.S. Congress passes a law that makes it illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of race. It's actually race, color, creed, sex, and national origin. By 1964, you cannot discriminate against people in any area of public life based on those criteria, those categories. Now, these legal measures, these legal commitments to non-discrimination did not produce plans to promote racial integration in industries, corporations, or civil institutions like colleges and universities that for decades had openly discriminated against racial and religious minorities. They also had little effect. This law has little effect on states that had widespread racial inequality, but that did not practice overt laws of discrimination. So the question stands, was outlawing racial discrimination enough to produce racial equality? Now, in the middle of the 1960s, the civil rights movement changes. It changes from a demand for equal opportunity and equal rights to demands for actual, tangible results. Several factors caused this. Most important was the assassination of President Kennedy and the unraveling of the civil rights movement. When President Kennedy was assassinated, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, made advancing civil rights and combating poverty his primary domestic policy agenda. To fulfill President Kennedy's legacy, Johnson led support for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which my colleague Jason Casellas will talk about later. President Johnson also genuinely believed that the United States needed to do more to eradicate poverty and social inequality. In 1965, while making a speech at one of the few historically black colleges, one of the few colleges that let black people in going back to the 19th century, when Johnson spoke there in 1965, he said, and I'll read the quote, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and theory, but equality as a fact, and this is most important, equality as a result." Now, the United States lacked the political will to actually follow up on Johnson's idealistic vision. Johnson was as committed to fighting for civil rights, and he was as committed to fighting against poverty as he was to fighting communism. The demands and costs of the Vietnam War diverted attention away from his domestic agenda and created tremendous civil dissent, especially among younger Americans. Then, violence swept through cities where large numbers of black people lived in racially segregated communities, which Americans began to call ghettos. The comparable, and forgive me if this term is not appropriate, but the comparable term that I've read in Brazil would be favelas. Now, in America, what they started to call ghettos were these areas where black people were concentrated to live through discrimination practices, through the inability to move into other neighborhoods, and a whole host of other structural inequities. These ghettos in America in the mid-1960s erupt in violence. And this is a picture from Newark, New Jersey in 1967. But this happened in Los Angeles, this happened in Newark, this happened in Detroit, this happened in Washington, D.C., it happened in cities across the country. Black citizens rejected discrimination from police, inequality in housing, inferior public schools, and limited job opportunities. Now, mind you, this happens in places that did not have laws that mandated racial discrimination. But if you want to hear more about that, I'm going to talk about that on Thursday. On several occasions, black people's anger exploded. And it was the urban disorders, it was the urban rebellions of the mid-1960s that forced an affirmative action as a method of crisis management to drive racial preference policies in employment and higher education. It was mixed with calls for black power in politics, economics, and cultural expressions as an approach to affirmative action that advocated for racial preferences in employment as forms of crisis management and took hold in policy-making circles. So affirmative action after this moment of disorder has less to do with dealing with the past of inequality and more to do with making sure that people don't erupt in violent protest. During this disorder and chaos, President Johnson said in a meeting, you can put these people to work and you won't have a revolution because they've been left out. If they're working, they won't be throwing bombs into your homes and plants, into your factories. Keep them busy and they won't have time to burn your cars. Now, for over 40 years, affirmative action evolved in the United States law to allow employers and college admissions officers to consider race, but only under very strict rules, as I said. Non-discrimination is the law, but private companies and universities can use racial preferences for minorities and can use preferences for women to advance diversity. Affirmative action has existed under intense controversy, protest, and confusion about how it works. Overall, in the 40 to 50 years since racial preferences, affirmative action has existed, some visible changes have occurred. So, what effects has affirmative action had? Affirmative action has enabled far more women and racial minorities to enter into professions that require high levels of education and training, like law and medicine. The United States Armed Forces has also been affected by using racial diversity to promote racial minorities and women as officers and non-commissioned officers. Affirmative action created temporary increases in the United States' most selective colleges, but those numbers have declined in recent history. Affirmative action overall has produced an increase in the number of blacks who have attained college education and the number of women. The number of black Americans with some college education has increased dramatically. So this is actually a graph, if I could just explain it very quickly. Over here you see 1970, and the light blue, or the blue, indicates the number of black people with less than a high school diploma. By 2008, that number has decreased significantly. And what's interesting here is the green and the orange, or the green and the yellow, which show black people with college degrees or some college education, in 1970 was about 16%, and it increases to over 50% by 2008. Whether these changes make the United States more equal is a matter of debate. Along with the gaps in educational attainment, gaps in wealth have also increased. So I'll just go through these rather quickly. Since affirmative action, gaps in wealth between whites and blacks have increased. Disparities in education debt has increased between blacks and whites. And there are major disparities in incarceration effects, in incarceration rates in the United States. So to illustrate, in 2016, the gap between white people with no college degree, the dark blue, the wealth gap, and with whites with college educations or higher, looks like this. For African Americans in 2016, if you have no college education, your wealth is down here. And even if you have some college, if you have college education, your wealth still stands at significantly lower than white Americans. Black students take on way more debt. Since 1992 to 1993, the dark blue, black students had about equal debt for their education with whites. By 2007, 2008, black debt shot up astronomically, and white debt increased, it looks like, about threefold as well. And the last very complicated graph shows incarceration rates and how they've changed from 1960 to 2010. The top line here are all black, are black men with no high school education. And here, this purple line is all black men, while the bottom line is all white men. In all age groups, all white men have experienced about the same levels of incarceration rates, while black men with no high school diplomas have seen incarceration rates shoot through the roof. So if this is also a reality in the United States during the same time period in which affirmative action took place, then the question stands, what effects does it have on racial equality? I raised an issue about doing comparative work. You can look at the histories of India and the histories of South Africa after apartheid to raise questions about what do policies that favor historically discriminated groups look like over time. And I would just put this out to students that there's a great deal of room for comparative research on this subject. My conclusions are that the United States has become more equal. Yes. Has the United States become more equal? Yes. And affirmative action in higher education plays a role in that. The United States has become more equal, and most critics of affirmative action are wrong to say that it helps some minorities but hurts others. We could talk about that if you want. The United States has become more equal, but criticism that affirmative action hurts its beneficiaries, I would argue, is based on selective evidence. And the United States has become more equal, but there are social disparities like wealth and prison that have grown or worsened. So to conclude, I would say that affirmative action is a form of racial justice, but it is a form of racial justice on the cheap. It does not come close to addressing all the effects of slavery and segregation and discrimination in the US. To redress racism, we need policies that consider race. And affirmative action in higher education and employment may not be the racial justice that the United States needs, but it is the racial justice that the United States has, and it's better than nothing. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Is it on? Okay, just stay closer. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you for the opening of this new center. It's really interesting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary nature of this center, which is one of the things that in the United States we talk a lot about, but we're not very good at executing. And I think one of the things that excites me about this day is that the execution looks like it's going to happen, and I really commend you for getting that work started. Today, then, I want to pick up where Brian left off, and I'll try to speak slowly as well. I normally speak very fast, but I know the translators have a harder job if I do speak fast. So I'm going to talk about, thank you, politics and ethnic diversity in the United States. And in particular, what I want to do is talk a little bit more about the growing Latino population in the United States of America. And when I say Latino, what do I mean? I mean mostly people who come from a Mexican-American background, Cuban-American, Puerto Rican, Dominican Republic. You can also look at South American countries like Argentina, Peru, and Central America as well. Are Brazilians Latino? I guess so, right? So that's one of the debates we have in Latino politics. I say you are. You have a very same culture. One of the things I wanted to show is the state of many disciplines. And just picking up what I said earlier about interdisciplinary work, this cartoon just asks the person to ask on the top, who wants change? Everyone raises their hand. And then the next question, who wants to change? And no one wants to change. And that says a lot, certainly in the United States and in many of our academic departments. We're very sort of insular. And I think interdisciplinary programs are excellent because they really bring different perspectives. Because to understand things, I think knowledge can best be produced from various perspectives. And so let me say a little bit about my own discipline of political science, and in particular research on race. Research on race and ethnicity. I think there are three types of marginalization in our field, and I think this is something that I wanted to bring up in the context of the opening of this new center, right? The first thing is that political scientists in particular have been slow to accept that the study of race, ethnicity, and politics, that's what we mean by REP, addresses important political questions. The argument by some is that it's narrow. It's something that it's not really important to everybody. And it's something that it's not really something we should care a lot about. Now, many of you here obviously don't agree with that. I certainly don't agree with that. But that's a widespread perspective. There's also a resistance to accept the idea that race, ethnicity, and immigration, which I want to talk a little bit more about in a second, matters to how we understand politics. And what I want to say is that race, ethnicity, and immigration is not only important about how do we understand politics, but it's essential. And we don't have to go back very far to see this, and I'm going to give you some examples in a second. And there's also a hostility to the methods used by scholars in the area of race, ethnicity, and politics. Many of these methods are non-traditional, methods that are not the norm, right? And I think when we're talking about the production of knowledge, as the center is embarking on, I think it's important to expand our horizons, right? And many of the methods used by scholars who work in race and ethnicity, I think are innovative and have a lot to offer. And so the mainstream view of race in American politics, as I said before, is race and ethnicity are factors in understanding American politics sometimes. However, not most of the time. And what I want to say is if you look at the contemporary era in politics, I think these concepts of race and ethnicity are central, right? Not peripheral. Scholars in this viewpoint contend it's possible to do studies of inequality. You know, Professor Purnell just talked a lot about inequality. And criminal justice without race as a core lens. And as the previous presentation, I think, made explicitly clear, you can't disentangle, right, inequality, criminal justice, and race. Right? These things go hand in hand. Critics also sometimes accuse scholars studying race or ethnicity as embarking in a project of something that's called me studies, right? Studying only your own background. And so the idea is that you only study Latino politics because you are personally Latino. No, we study it because it's fascinating, it's interesting. I happen to be Latino, yes, but it's super important, right? And I'm going to try to make the case for you in a few minutes here. And there's this big debate about identity politics, certainly in the United States and in Brazil. And that debate about sort of, I guess they call it balkanization, and it really refers back to me politics as well. But I think the consensus now is that pretty much all politics is identity politics. And if you look at the last election, there's been a lot of work about sort of white identity politics. I recommend a book by Ashley Jardina, who looks at white identity politics, in particular how it was manifested, or at least brought up to the surface in our recent election. And I can recommend some other books as well, because there's a lot of innovative research that tackles identity politics as not just African American or Latino, but all politics. So the alternative viewpoint I'm going to present here is that race, ethnicity, and immigration matter. It's important, it's central. And we really cannot understand American politics, or American history for that matter, without this lens. Has our country evolved on race, right? Certainly when our previous president, Barack Obama, was elected in 2008, many commentators said that we had turned a corner, and indeed we did. We elected an African American as president, right? But, you know, obviously things happened after that. And so at the time, people thought that that was something that was a, that was a mark of a new era. There's this idea of colorblindness, right, or a post-racial America, right, that we should look beyond race, right, that when I see someone, I don't see their race, right, you often hear this. And it really refers back to the affirmative action debate as well, right? These things are all connected, I think. And I want to say something else. Race does not only mean a black-white dichotomy, and for much of American history it has. If you look at the politics in the history of the South, as Professor Purnell just, eloquently did, obviously it was a black-white phenomenon. But what we see today is not just the growing Latino population, but also the growing Asian American population. And Latinos are one of the few groups in the United States that's growing exponentially. And I'll show you some numbers in a second where you can see it's one of the few demographics where you see a rapid increase. 18% of the population nationwide is Latino. Many are concentrated in southwest of the United States. So states where I'm from, like Texas, which is 38% Latino, right? States like New Mexico, which is 48% Latino. Arizona, which is about 30% Latino. Now, all these states, remember, were part of Mexico up until 1848. So it's not a mystery, right, why there are a lot of Mexicans living there, you know? Sometimes people forget this, right? There's an old joke, right, that Mexican Americans often say is that we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? You probably heard this one. So that's something to keep in context as well, and oftentimes we forget that. So what does the American politics literature have to say about the centrality of race? Vince Hutchings and Nick Valentino have written an excellent article I recommend in the Annual Review of Politics, in which they argue that race is critical to understanding public opinion, and I'm going to show you some data in a second, representation, our political institutions, our media, campaigns, everything. Race is central, right? And that different areas of the literature are not in conversation with one another. And this is why I mentioned the interdisciplinary aspect. We can't even talk to each other in our own discipline. That's difficult, right? And so I think it's important to look at all kind of different perspectives, because you really learn more that way. And then I think more research should be done about how race and ethnicity impact politics. And I think we're slowly getting there in the United States. And one of the things that I'm really hopeful about this center is I think people here so far from what I've seen with the introductory ceremony get it, right? Get it that it's important to be interdisciplinary. Well, let me just highlight two contemporary examples of the importance of race in American politics. And I'll just say a little bit about the election in 2016. It's obviously in everyone's mind, right? So the question about the election of our president. And next is the disaster and humanitarian crisis on the island of Puerto Rico, which happened in 2017. So you have these two events. Well, let's talk about the election. Oftentimes when we look at the election, we just look at the final outcome and to say one person won, the other person lost, right? But it's important to, I think deeper about these things. Well, if you look at how Americans voted, there's a big division in terms of how people vote by their race or ethnicity. So 58% of white people voted for Donald Trump. 65% of Asian Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, the Democratic candidate. 89% of African Americans for Hillary Clinton, and 79% of Latinos for Clinton, okay? And so I think one of the interesting things here about studying the 2016 election is that there's been a lot of research from political scientists, because if you recall, every political scientist got it wrong. Everyone thought Hillary Clinton would win, right? And it didn't happen, and everyone was like, oh gosh, how did that happen, right? And so Michael Tesler, in a really good book, he argues and makes the case scientifically that racial attitudes drove vote choice. And the language that was employed in the campaign was explicitly racial, or at least racialized. And I think one of the other things that's interesting as well is the polling of different communities. One of the things when you look at an election, there's something called an exit poll. And what an exit poll is when people leave the voting booth, they are asked, who did you vote for? And you respond. Now, they don't do exit polls in every single precinct because it's impossible. It would cost too much money. But when we're talking about polling Latinos, they do not accurately reflect the Latino population, because the people who are living in precincts in urban areas or in other more wealthy areas, there's a big skew in terms of how exit polls are conducted. And so when the election came around and it was said that 30% of Latinos voted for Trump, that's just not correct. It's obviously lower. I guess if you take 100 minus 79, you get your answer there. You can do math. All right. This kind of got chopped off here, but I mean, I'll provide the PowerPoint. Here you just get a sense of age made a big difference as well. The younger population, you have all these different generations now. I can't keep track anymore. You have Generation Z, Generation X, I'm the X generation. I've already revealed my age. Millennials, right? The millennials, it's all this. And so if you see younger individuals, right, are much more likely to vote for Democratic candidates, and the older individuals were more likely to vote for Republican candidates. The difference, of course, is that the older you get, the more likely you are to vote. So that could help explain a little bit of the outcome here. And so there are a lot of variations, and I encourage you probably all looked at some of this, but that gives you a sense of that. Let me just move quickly to the Hurricane Maria, because that's something that if you look at what happened on that island, it was a complete and utter devastation. Now, Puerto Rico, of course, is a U.S. Commonwealth. So they have their own governor, but they are not a state. So they cannot vote for the president. Okay? Now, around the same time of Hurricane Maria, a little bit before that, Hurricane Harvey was a really bad hurricane that hit my city of Houston, Texas, causing lots of flooding. Inundaciones is probably how you say it, or something like that. And so if you look at the media coverage, the online media coverage, you can just look at the difference between how the media covered a disaster that happened within the U.S. territory and how they covered the Puerto Rico disaster of Hurricane Maria. This got some media attention, but obviously there's a big difference here, and you can just see it in terms of this graph. Is this state failure? The storm hit on September 20th. It took 12 days later. 95% of the island was still without electricity, without power, after 12 days. Now, Puerto Rico does have an infrastructure in terms of electricity grid that's not very good, and so the hurricane really made the problem really bad. 11% of the island had cell phone service, only 11%, so it was very difficult for people to communicate with each other. 55% did not have potable water. And of the open hospitals, they were running on generators, so they didn't have a lot of electricity. The San Juan mayor went on the news, and this was a very emotional plea for the U.S. federal government. Please help us, right? Please assist us with this, because we are Americans. Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States. And so why, right? Why the difference? You know, you have Puerto Rico as an island, which has sort of a commonwealth. They cannot vote for president. So what's the electoral incentive to reach out to them instead of other individuals in other parts of the country? In terms of demographics, I think, as we said before, it's important to note how demographics will change American culture and politics. There's often the saying that demography is destiny. This is a saying you hear a lot about. I think it's a simple phrase that's not exactly right. I think what's important is demography can make a difference, but there are a lot of other factors that keep other groups in particular from fully participating in politics. And I'll get to some of that probably at the next talk. I need to put in a plug for my next talk, as Brian did. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. And so if you look at the Hispanic population, look at that. That's the population that's growing much more than any others. The over 65 is another population, so the baby boomer generation retiring. And of course, that's going to put a strain on the nation's social security system, but I won't talk about that. That's another talk. And then if you look at the growth relative to 2014 in terms of the total population, there's also a rapid growth projected from 2020 up until 2050. And let me say this. When I first started teaching, I won't tell you the year, the projections were very, very conservative. And I kept updating my slides to my students, and all the projections and the demographers were wrong. They really thought that the Latino population wouldn't grow as fast as it has. And people are really surprised about how the Latino population is growing so fast, beyond any demographer's prediction. So if anything, I would argue that it's an understatement. of how fast the Hispanic population is growing for a lot of reasons. And it's not about immigration in terms of the border and all that. It's about a lot of other things, about the birth rates. There's a lot of other things that explain it, okay? So if you look at diversity by county in the United States, county is our sort of unit within a state. You know, in the United States we have 50 states, so it's a federalist system. And each state has governing units that are local called counties. Just want to make sure we're on the same page here. But if you look at diversity, this would just be how diverse a county is. And as you can see, the Southwest, Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, right? Very diverse. Our border counties on South Texas are 75, 80% Latino, Hispanic. And of course, Southern California, and then down in Florida. But what we're seeing in the United States is that we're seeing immigration to places that we never thought there would be immigrants. Iowa. I give extra credit if you can come point Iowa on the map. I'm just kidding. But you see all the coasts, right, which is where the cities are, but even in some of the heartland, as it's called. So our country is becoming more diverse, not simply in the traditional areas, the cities, but you see, in particular, Mexican immigrants going to work in all over the country, Iowa, Kansas, North Carolina, so on. The Latino population changed from 2000 to 2010. You see most of the growth here all over the South, the traditional South. So you have North Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, states where the only racial politics was black-white for many, many years. But now, like in North Carolina, you basically see a really, really fast-growing Mexican immigrant population, which is really changing the state in many ways and changing how people think about race and ethnicity. And so many have gone there to work in pork processing plants, in particular in North Carolina. In Arkansas, there's a big company called Tyson Chicken, and so they go work in the chicken plants to do jobs that many Americans don't want to do. Minority population change, if you just look at all minorities, you can see the blue, dark blue areas happening pretty much everywhere, you know, with the exception of northern Montana or places that don't have any industry. I hope no one's from Montana here. If you look at the projected population change, right, from 2012 to 2000, again, what we see here is Hispanic of any kind from 17 to 31%. That's where you see most of the growth, right? Whites, it's going to be from 78% in 2012. Sorry, in 2000, 69% of the population. By 2012, 78%. Sorry, that's 2060. I can't read. So what we're seeing is basically the white population will decline in the United States. The Hispanic population will increase, okay? The black population will slightly increase. So I think it's important, and also the Asian American population will be a slight increase as well. Asian Americans are a very fast-growing group in the United States, but just not the same numbers as the Latino population. So I'll just conclude here by saying a few words about immigration. In particular, the United States was founded as a nation of immigrants, right? If you look at the history of the United States, the Pilgrims, right, came to Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. They were Puritans who were fleeing religious persecution, right? And then after that, the United States was open to pretty much anyone who could make it there. Many went to Ellis Island, which was the processing center in New York City. You know, Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. You had people from Italy fleeing economic hardships. You had people coming from other parts of Eastern Europe, from Poland. And then by 1924, Congress passes the National Origins Act, which sought to limit a lot of that immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. And then after that, you saw some areas of restrictionist policies. There was a concern about growing Catholics coming to the United States. So there was always some kind of an element of restrictionism in the United States. In a sense, people who may have been untrustworthy of new immigrants. Could they adapt? Could they become American, right, whatever that means? And so they had a political party that emerged called the Know Nothings, right, which is a very anti-Catholic party that didn't like these Irish and Italian immigrants. And since 1965, however, immigration to the US has largely been from Asia and Latin America. In particular, right now, if you watch the news, right, the immigration issue at the border with people fleeing Central America, and the gang violence in El Salvador, the unaccompanied minors coming to the United States or trying to come to the United States. And so this has obviously caused a lot of recent political controversy. So if you read the news, you know that this is an issue. But one of the things that's clear is that there have always been forces opposed to increased immigration based on a variety of reasons. It could be a cultural reason, right? Can these people assimilate into American values? It could be an economic reason. For many years, a lot of union members didn't like more immigrants because they would depress wages. So it was a sort of economic competition. Religious reasons, right? There was a, you know, if someone's coming to the United States who's Muslim, right? That was an issue recently in the news too. So all these things matter, right? And the US, I argue, is stronger today because of these waves of immigrants, you know, the Irish and the Italians, and later groups, right? People from Latin America, right, coming to the United States because of these waves of immigrants and their descendants. And I think the American Studies program should engage this reality of the nation's immigrant past, right? Because the US wouldn't be what it is today without immigration. I mean, that's a simple fact. The present, of course, and how immigration is such an important issue to understand, and it's a very complex issue. Despite what politicians and news media and others try to make it so simple, it's very complicated. There's skilled immigration, there's unskilled immigration, and how we should craft our policies, I think, should be more nuanced, and we need to pay more attention to trying to craft a policy that's humane, right, and that also respects borders. You know, these are important. So there's a lot of, I think, emotional attachments to this issue, but it's a serious issue that we need to address. And I think interdisciplinary programs do provide the opportunity to study all these aspects of the United States. So humanities, culture, politics is obviously what I study, so I think it's important. But all these things coming together, I think, would make for a fascinating American Studies program. And I really commend you here for putting it together, and I really look forward to looking from afar how successful it becomes. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And I don't know if this is correct. Obrigado. Alguma dúvida? I don't know if I'm right, but I tried there.
I want to thank you very much, Professors Purnell and Casellas, for giving such a wonderful talks on the state of the art, the United States as of now. It was really illuminating, really enriching for each one of us, I'm pretty sure. And now if you agree on having some Q&A, sure. So wonderful. So we have some time now for a few questions. I'll be taking 3 or 4 questions in a row. 3 ou 4 perguntas em sequência, para a gente ter mais tempo de discutir. Vamos lá, então.
Yeah. Is it okay?
Lá no final, depois o professor Cristiano aqui. Mariana.
Hi, good evening.
Okay.
It was very amazing, because I have lived with, actually I basically grew up with American pop culture, so we've seen all of this happening from afar.
Closer.
Oh, sorry. So I've seen all of this happening from afar, and it's very interesting to have the point of view of somebody who's on the inside and who's researching this, as you guys are. I have one question and one other observation. My question is, I have lived in Canada for a year of my life, and there the immigration is a little more recent, and the memory of where you are from and where your family is from is a lot stronger. So when you ask them, where are you from? They don't tell you the city they're from. They tell you, oh, I'm Irish. I don't know, I'm Irish Italian. That's where your parents are from. I wanted to know how that is with, in the United States, because I don't have a lot of contact with that, because you're talking about immigration and the Latinos and the Asian Americans. Is this how it is happening there, or they have this pride and this community, or are they just, oh, I'm from there and I'm here and I'm just trying to be a person from this new country? And in speaking about the interdisciplinarity, I have some suggestions. Maybe you guys could get some people from literature into the discussion, because both of the discussions have a lot of books and romance books that, like, not fiction, both fiction and non-fiction, that tell a lot about those stories. I have seen the amount of books that have come out in the United States in the past year about the story and the point of view of immigrants living there, and about the black people and their problems today. I mean, the book that turned into a movie, The Hate You Give, and all of that.
Thank you. Suggestion taken. Remember, it's just day one, so there's
Sorry.
time. There's a long future ahead.
Sorry.
So Professor Cristiano Rodrigues, next one.
Can I have this one? So I'd like to thank you guys for the talk. It was amazing, especially for me, who I'm also in the field of political science and studying race and politics, and a lot of things, especially that Professor Casellas talked on how marginalized our field of study is in mainstream political science. I mean, it works the same way in Brazil, so I guess it's refreshing and at the same time depressing to hear it. We are so close in that.
Very similar.
We are expecting more. But anyways, I think I have two questions, one for each of you. I will probably try to get like short questions because I don't want to give a lecture here. So the first question is for Professor Purnell. The history you told us about affirmative action is very interesting, and I've seen an attack on affirmative action policies in the U.S. It happens the same way in Brazil right now, and at the same time, there's this attack coming from the right wing, the far right. There's also a growing talk on reparation, because as you said, affirmative action policies are on the chip, and then you have either people saying, okay, too much, and there are people saying not enough. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on reparation, especially after, I don't know if you've read the Ta-Nehisi Coates on the case for reparations, and that's how the talk have started in the US. And then the second question, it's more about also the Democrats. We have 24 pre-candidates, and they're all talking about reparation, and also the growing, like how do I say that? Like the Democrat turn in the middle term elections. Do you think that's going to have an effect on the presidential election? Like how immigration and race and ethnicity will play a role during these elections? All right, thank you.
Thank you. Next one. Okay, so I'll give the floor to Professors Purnell and Casellas.
Okay. Should I go first? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? So yeah, the question about Irish and Italians, that's really interesting. If you go to New York or Chicago, you still see a lot of cultural heritage. In terms of Irish, there are St. Patrick's Day parades in all these different cities like Boston, New York, New Orleans. Even with Italians as well. But one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that you don't see sort of like for Italians, the Italian language still spoken. Or with the Irish, of course, Irish and Italians have sort of assimilated to the point where though politicians who are Irish or Italian, like Andrew Cuomo was the governor of New York, or Irish American politicians. Joe Biden, is one of the 24, or is it 25 now? I don't know. Right. So I think one of the things that's interesting about that is that I think part of the story of how they sort of assimilated, right, was intermarriage, right, was a big issue, right? And I think we see that with Latinos as well, that you see a really high intermarriage rate. And so one of the differences, though, is that we still have a long border with Mexico, and we still have more immigrants coming from Latin America, so the Spanish language is still continued, whereas with the Italians, that they came through Ellis Island, and you don't see this continual immigration. And so I think that could be one difference there. But I think there is still some cultural pride that you can see manifested in these kind of events. Oh, the midterm elections, right? Yeah. So obviously, right now you see a situation in which there's this conflict between the House of Representatives, led by our Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and the President of the United States, and the big question about impeachment and whether the Democrats will choose to impeach the president. And I think the issue of impeachment, as many of you know, impeachment is just an indictment. So the House has the votes probably now to impeach the president, but you need 2/3 of senators to remove the president from office, which is not likely given that Republicans control the Senate. So, speaking from a purely analytical perspective, from a political scientist perspective, yeah, probably the president would want the House to impeach him so he can run against Nancy Pelosi. I think that's what he would want. But I think Nancy Pelosi is smart enough to know that that's not a wise thing to do. Now, she has members of her caucus who are really pushing hard for impeachment because their own voters want impeachment. And so I think that's the story. Will immigration be an issue next year? Absolutely. I can expand on that, but it will be an issue.
I very much, is this on? Yeah. I very much liked the question about, do people in the United States, immigrants, do they still have the memory of being from their homeland? It's a wonderful question because it has a lot to do with what they call assimilation. Mm-hmm. But I think, too, it has a lot to do with the United States and people living in the United States coming to terms with the reality that, as Professor Casellas said, America is a nation of immigrants. People don't want to recognize that. And so when immigrants or their children or their grandchildren face hostility, rejection from being included in the American family, sometimes people will push back and not distance themselves from their immigrant heritage out of shame, but sometimes they will lay claim to being American as a way of pushing back against the hostility that they face. And then, too, to your question, I think there would be generational changes, whereas the grandchild of an immigrant may not identify as such, but the child might. And again, your observation about literature was fantastic. I wrestled with how to talk about literature because literature is so important to American studies, and to just addressing the question of who and what a American or a Brazilian, it's our literature, it's the stories that we tell that give shape to our identity. If English translation literature is not, I would include movies and television to that genre, and theater, right? So, who are Americans in 2017, 16? See the musical Hamilton as a way that's very much about immigration and America and class and politics. Reparations. I'll just say there is a congressman, John Conyers from Michigan, who every year, this congressman, a black man, every year for the past over 2 decades, I believe, has tried to bring a resolution to our Congress to study reparations, to study whether or not or what it would look like. And every year, that resolution has been defeated. So, the reparations as a tangible means of addressing centuries of unpaid labor, I wouldn't hold my breath for it in the United States. But what we do see are institutions like Georgetown University, Brown University, that will say that they're going to study their institutions' connections to slavery. And then Georgetown has recently made the suggestion of having kind of a permanent scholarship for black students. You can call that reparations, but it's not.
Ok, mais uma ou duas perguntas. Por favor. O cavalheiro lá ao fundo.
My name is Luis. I'm from the, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, from the political science program here. I had a question similar to Professor Cristiano's, to Professor Purnell, but it's more like when you see the results about affirmative politics, and somehow it's comparable to Brazil. We see like some changes, especially in higher education, but you still have like this wide gap in terms of wealth and incarceration. Definitely, it's the case here. And so when you think about reparation, when you think about affirmative action, they have like, let's say, a ceiling. So they got results in some areas, and maybe it's because it's in terms of social and economic system. So my question is more like, how do you feel, or how do you think, what's your stand about this? If it's, you have to draft other kind of affirmative policies that could address this, or this is basically under like a reparation umbrella. And for Professor Casellas, it's more like about political science. We're still starting to see like the demographic demographic data about our election here, 2018, and it seems to have like a racial divide, but definitely a gender divide. And this was not the case for previous elections. Even when we had like a woman, Dilma, you didn't have like a gender divide in terms of voting. And there is a growing literature about polarization in the United States. The recent book I read was from Liliana Mason about this and civil agreement. And because you said identity politics, so I would like to, how do you see this idea of identity politics in terms of aligning different identities like religious and racial, and then partisanship identity? This is the major point of Mason's book. And especially because Liliana and other scholars about polarization, they were looking for like 2004, 2018 election, 2008, sorry, and then they stopped before Trump. And in Brazil, we might be seeing something like this in terms of having demographic divides. We don't know if this is going to continue, so this is like pretty recent to make a point. But how do you feel, how do you see this literature about polarization and identity politics? Thank you.
Uma pergunta final. Muito bem. Closer to the mic. Yeah, it's
Hi, my name is Watifani Poe. I'm a student from the United States. I'm a doctoral student. I'm here on a Fulbright. I wanted to thank you both for your presentations, and I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the connections between your two presentations. Professor Purnell, you gave a great talk thinking about African Americans in the process of affirmative action. And then Professor Casellas, you gave an amazing talk about immigration in relation to Latino populations. And I wanted to ask a little bit about the changing that Latin American populations arriving in the US is doing to how we are understanding race. So thinking about the growing Afro-Latino movement in the United States and how these kinds of conversations are going to change how we're going to be talking about certain immigrant populations. So thinking about what is changing in terms of our populations that are arriving from places like the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil. How are these changing the ways in which we're talking about race and how we're thinking about what is Black, what is Latino?
great.
Those are really good questions. Oh, okay. So I'll try to take the one on identity politics. And there's another book. I haven't read Liliana's book, but it's got an amazing coverage, and I really want to read it. Another book, Catherine Kramer Walsh, she writes about rural consciousness and rural identity. And she looks at this white voters in rural Wisconsin. You know, Wisconsin is one of those states that had traditionally voted for Democrats and then voted for Trump in the last election. And so she goes in and talks to these individuals in rural Wisconsin and kind of discovers this rural consciousness, this rural identity. And one of the things that, you know, we try to think about is that racial as well, right? Is that too conflated with race? And you know, she doesn't really address that head on, but I think that's something to consider, right? That there's this identity that many people have in rural Wisconsin, where they feel that people in cities, in particular, are taking advantage of, their tax dollars or whatever. So I think that urban-rural divide is something that's not talked a lot about in our politics, and I think it's very important. I mean, if you look at our last election in Texas, we had a really close U.S. Senate race where the division between how people vote in cities versus how people vote in rural counties is very stark. Now, that's obviously very correlated with race. And so is it race, or is it sort of something about rural versus urban identity? I think that would be a fascinating way forward, right, to look at identity politics in a much more nuanced way than just black identity, white identity, Latino identity, because identity is not such a simple concept, right? And there's also this concept in which how much people identify with their identity, right? And so there's this concept in political science called linked fate. And the question that we ask people in surveys is, does it matter? I mean, does it matter to you how the black community does, or the Latino community does? In other words, do you see a sense of linked fate with other members of your group, or do you see yourself as separate, right? And Rita mentioned that I'm working on a new book looking at Latino Republicans, because I think that's an interesting case of identity. Do they see themselves more as Latino or more as Republican, right? And in what ways do they still see themselves as Latino, or in what issues, right? That can get a little more complicated. And so I think that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of ripe areas for research there. You also asked about, what else? I don't have a pen up here. What was your other point? Polarization. Yeah. So obviously that's everyone's talking about polarization in American politics, and I think oftentimes we focus on that because you could just look at roll call votes in Congress and see polarization rates have increased. I think one of the interesting things, though, is that there have been some remarkable successes that we've seen in terms of policies, and we were talking about criminal justice reform just the other night. That criminal justice reform happened at the federal level. It was a bipartisan, accomplishment. And so polarization is a reality. I'm not denying that. But oftentimes there are positives, that we see policy being made despite the perception that it's not being made, despite the perception of gridlock. And do I think gridlock is a problem? Yes, obviously, but there's still some glimmer of hope, I think. Hopefully we'll see more cooperation, but it's easy to be pessimistic, I guess. It's the easy way to say it.
These are very good questions, and I'll begin with Luis's question that picked up on Professor Rodriguez's question about reparations, repairing the history of injustices that fell upon people because of racism and discriminatory practice. This is just my opinion, but I think history proves it. I don't think United States culture or its approach to policies, United States culture with its emphasis on the individual as significant, and with United States culture emphasis on being a nation of liberty. I don't see a massive attention given towards direct reparations for descendants of enslaved people. I don't see that culturally or politically possible. The best the United States could do would be to try to do more to invest in the institutions that promote healthy civil society, education, recreation, literacy, training, culture, the arts. Now, whether or not the United States could do that and could focus on communities that are in desperate need, That's a political question that, and I would not call that reparations for slavery, but I think that that would be the best that the United States could do. And one example that I would give would be around questions of criminal justice, and specifically around policing. So an irony amongst black populations in American cities is that black populations in American cities need police protection. But what they get is they get over-policing and under-protection, meaning they're over-policed for daily non-criminal activity, and they're under-protected in terms of the ways that they experience violent crime, homicide, and just general low quality of life because of illegal narcotic sales, high presence of gangs, weapons, etc. So, black people in the United States need to have adequate police protection, but that would require massive changes in police training, in community police relationships, in the ways that police investigate, and the ways that state's attorneys prosecute crimes. That it would require a massive reorientation from what the United States has done for the past 40 years. So there is hope with this new federal legislation, but whether or not that is able to infect all of the different institutions that need it, we'd have to see. The question about what Latino immigration is doing to race in America is absolutely fascinating. And I don't know how to answer that at all. Because I think it would depend on what part of the country we're looking at, where these where Latino immigrants are coming from. Are they coming from the Caribbean? Are they coming from Central America? It's a wonderful, wonderful. What ideas about race do Latinos bring to the U.S.? Right. It's a wonderful question, and I would say it's one that I hope can add to America's, or the United States' needed continuation of dealing with the history of slavery and racial segregation. So Latino immigration should not replace the United States' attentiveness to the history of racism, even if Latinos bring very different cultures and understandings of race from where they come from and what they do in American society. We need to do both, is how I would say to that. But that's a great, you should do, that's a great question for research. That's a great question.
Okay, excellent. So CENA Day 1 is coming to a close, but honestly, I see a very bright future ahead, and I thank you, professors, for inspiring us so much during the whole day, and the talks you gave were absolutely wonderful, and I'm pretty sure that this is just the beginning of a conversation that will go on and on and on. And hopefully for UFMG, we can rely on your support, your generous help with the U.S., the American studies, and you can also be sure you will always find in us a reliable, a good partner for academic travails. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I just want to remind you, so I will need my aide-mémoire. Tomorrow, at 7 p.m. at this Faculty of Economics, but downstairs, auditorium number 2, Professor Casellas will be giving a talk on Latino representation and voting in the United States. Whereas on Thursday, Professor Purnell will be addressing the issue of racial discrimination and Jim Crow North, also at the School of Economics, auditorium number 2. So I think it's all for the day. It's all for now. Thank you very much. And good luck to all of us. Good luck to CENA. Thank you all.